everybody, and hi, Sunil. We're back again with another episode, and this week we're talking about the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, who have said that global growth, and I quote, is going to be surprisingly resilient in 2023. The bad news, however, is that the UK is forecast to shrink and have worse economic growth even than Russia, who are riddled with sanctions.
Well, I suppose the UK number was a bit of a disappointment in what was otherwise an optimistic forecast. I mean, having said that, if it's any consolation, the IMF does think that Germany is going to go slower than Russia as well. But it was overall an optimistic picture. So a growth picture of 3%. Most developed economies actually avoiding recession, which I think markets would not have expected 6 or 9 months ago. And it's probably about 1% higher than most of the market expectations have been going around for the last 6 months.
So good news for the global economy, if you believe the IMF. Bad news for the UK. So what have been the driving factors then that have kind of made the IMF more optimistic for growth in 2023?
Well, I guess two things that maybe people weren't so sure about a few months ago. The first one is not just the fact that China is reopening, stepping away from its zero COVID policy, but how quickly it stepped away from that policy, and the signs, for example, that flights within China have gone up faster than we even saw in 2019. So that makes quite a big difference, not just in China, but the rest of Asia and even Europe. And then for Europe specifically, actually, the concern was about an energy crisis, not just higher energy prices, but also some rationing where people are forced to use less energy. And actually, we've had quite a mild winter. Think of all those ski slopes, nice and green. And that has probably helped in terms of kind of protecting household incomes and balance sheets.
Speaking of China reopening, alcohol beverages sales are way up in China at the moment, and it does feel a bit reminiscent of when we came out of lockdown. But anyway, so it seems like some of the good news stories for global growth could also be applicable to the UK. So why has the UK been sidelined as a specific region that's shrinking? In fact, the only region, G7 country, that's shrinking.
Well, the UK probably has been helped a bit by the energy situation. I guess if you get sort of into the bean counting, it's probably helped the government more than it's helped the private sector, because it was the government that said it was going to spend as much money as it took to kind of buffer people against energy price rises. I think for the private sector, probably there've still been some challenges that we haven't really been able to deal with. So higher borrowing costs, if you think about the mortgage market, energy prices could have been worse, but still have come up quite a long way. And then you have the backdrop of a gradually rising average rate of tax, shortages of worker for companies. And I think the IMF has just put those factors together and does think that the UK economy is going to struggle with the pressure.
So really one more final question. We've talked a lot about IMF forecasts today, but how much credence can we really put on their forecasts? So do they always get it right?
Well, it pains me to talk about imperfect forecasts from economists, but I would say the IMF is no worse in that regard than the average forecast. I think there was a study which said the average forecast misses about 2%. So it could be anywhere this year between 1 and 5. I mean, I think in their defense, obviously, specific point numbers is very hard to predict with precision. And I guess what you would say is when it comes to not just the numbers, but the underlying analysis, it probably is the most widely read set of forecasts in the world. And if you think about this kind of outlook combined with maybe some better inflation data, a peak in interest rates, it could be very promising for investor sentiment. Have to say, in terms of our views in portfolios, we're perhaps a bit more cautious, not least when you look at the stock market. Even if economic growth is okay, it's not hard to see some challenges for company profit margins, some signs of that in the earnings season that we're seeing right now. So that probably leaves us feeling that the outlook needs to be a little bit more cautious.
Okay, so in that case, let's hope then that the IMF are correct with global growth, but wrong about UK economic growth. But that's been really interesting. Thanks so much, Sunil, for your time today. And of course, thanks for everyone for watching, and we'll be back again next week with another episode.